Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. Love, Rinse, Repeat is recorded on the unceded sovereign lands of the Gayamargal people, and we're very excited today to welcome Michael Graziano. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So Michael, for those who don't know, is the Assistant Professor of Religion at the University of Northern Iowa. His research focuses on the relationship between religion, law, and government in the United States, and in particular, interested in how the US government decides what counts as religious and how it chooses to engage religious people's ideas and institutions. His book, his relatively recently released book, is Errand into the Wilderness of Mirrors, Religion and the History of the CIA, which is out with the University of Chicago Press. You can get it now wherever you get books. So, Michael, I guess starting with the book, I guess where did the idea come from to go, you know what needs to be explored? Or even this idea that, how did you first come aware, I guess, that religion was somehow a category that played some influence in the OSS and then into the CIA, that like, you know, that initial, oh, that's something, there's something here. And then how did that kind of then turn into, actually, I think there's enough here and I'm interested in this enough to make this a book?
Yeah, it's a good question. This was not in any way, shape, or form the project I had originally envisioned doing. This comes out of my dissertation, I guess, with the main differences being that the final book is much shorter and hopefully better. But it's, I've always been interested in religion and law. And so in the US, I've always been interested in sorts of First Amendment issues, how that plays out in the public square. But my original idea for the project was actually something a bit different. I was interested in how anti-Catholicism in the United States played out with respect to national security concerns in the Cold War. And as I was doing some early sort of preliminary poking around in various archives for that project, I stumbled into the story of Tom Dooley, which is basically just part of the story of the CIA's efforts as part of the Vietnam War to get Americans to think about Catholicism differently. And I'd never encountered this. I'd never heard of this. And so I kind of pulled on that thread, and the rest of the project came together bit by bit. And so for me, I think it wasn't something that I had thought about before, but once I got into the archives and started tracking down some names, it made sense to me that for many of the same reasons I found studying religion interesting, that intelligence officers in various decades would have found it useful as well.
Yeah. So I think, one of the things I was struck by as I was reading through the book, and particularly in the early days, is how much this is a book definitely about the CIA and religion, but like how much this is also a book about religious studies, and particularly how religious studies shapes things more than maybe they expected, right? So much of how the CIA is and the OSS into the CIA is going to approach religion is based on what academics and a bit of popular conscious thought about religion at the time in the 40s and the 50s, or how they had, and this newfound interest in world religions.
Yes.
So I guess talk to us a bit about how the way the CIA, about the way it was approached and how that was not like just invented in a vacuum, but was actually the outworking of the kind of the way that field was at the time.
Yes. I've always been interested in the history of the academic study of religion. I originally, that was another one of my ideas for the project early on, was to sort of write up that history in North America. And I think, the main problem with that is that there's like 17 people who might be interested in reading such a thing, right? Like it's pretty niche. And so one of the things I was really excited about with this project is that it does let me work in, as you noted, some of the other developments happening in the broader study of religion. So one of the things that immediately jumped out to me was some of the traces you can find in some of the actual kind of academic work at the time. So Huston Smith's Religion of Man, I mentioned this at one point in the book, but it's the first or second edition. In the preface of that book, he talks about one of the reasons for doing comparative religious studies is that the US military is going to need to know this stuff to like rule people or work with them or whatever, right? And so it's a very kind of applied religious studies understanding. And this was all part of a much larger piece of how folks in the US and other places around the world too were thinking about religion. And so the big one that jumps out to me is that both in the CIA, as well as its predecessor, the OSS, and in a lot of universities at the time, religion was kind of seen as this universal translator. I call it a Rosetta Stone in the book, because one of the assumptions that people had at this time was that if you could understand one particular religious tradition, you could understand others. And it's, of course, a very essentialist understanding of religion, right? If you could get to the core, you could figure it out, and you could then use that to scaffold an understanding of other religious systems. And of course, for an intelligence agency, really for any sort of government agency, the appeal here was that, you wouldn't have to sort of have a study of each religion necessarily. You wouldn't have to have specialists in every area. If you can crack, Roman Catholicism, you can figure out Buddhism or something,
right.
which sounds right. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but this is also some of the stuff we found in the archives. And so along with this, that basically religion could be a universal translator, it could get past ideas or differences of language, ethnicity, culture. There's also the idea held by many in the US that the world's religions were not just sort of essentially linked like that, but that simply by virtue of being religions, they were anti-communist, pro-freedom, whatever that means, also pro-free market, which is curious, and would naturally sort of be an ally against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And that assumption, in many cases, I found largely went unquestioned until sort of the dramatic conclusion to my book is the fallout from the Iranian Revolution, when I think many analysts sort of realized that religion could actually meaningfully challenge US interests on the world stage, right? That it wasn't a foregone conclusion that to be religious was to love the United States or something like this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it might be interesting to take it there because you talk about that in that chapter about, that it was very much the view on religion and what religious people would be like that led the intelligence think there's no way the Shah is going to be challenged. It's not a threat that's going to come from the religious. So talk to us a bit about that, about how that kind of, I guess, as the outplay of this, because it's interesting you talk about how on the other end of things, it was the kind of the early victories in World War II that was see, it works. And then that kind of held, and maybe we'll jump into some of the other bits in between, but I'm interested in kind of how that, I guess the as you say, that kind of came tumbling down a little bit there at the end.
Sure, yeah. I'm just trying to think, the simplest way I think to talk about it is that as you mentioned, right, at the beginning of the story is a story about building confidence in these intelligence agencies because of the perceived role they played in the victories in World War II and the early Cold War. It's probably worth noting that a lot of those victories, what they called the religious approach to intelligence may not have been due for as much credit as they sometimes gave it. But nonetheless, right, this sort of encouraged the idea that this was a profitable avenue for intelligence work, and so it builds and builds. And after the Iranian Revolution, you see a couple things happen, but the big one is that all of a sudden religion within the body of US intelligence work gets looked at much more critically. And so in the lead up to the revolution in the late 70s even, there's an uptick in coverage of Islam, there's an uptick in coverage of Iran, but it's again this idea that Ayatollah Khomeini is just basically that he's crazy, and he's almost described as like a time traveler, right? That he's this guy that's kind of from the ancient past, and there's all of these incredible quotes in the documentary record about, there's no way he could run a modern country because, someone of his religious interest isn't interested in the modern world. He doesn't fit. That's the thing that keeps coming back. He doesn't fit. And then he does fit, as it turns out, right? And all of a sudden they sort of have to reassess what went wrong. And so from 1977, 1978, then to 1980, 81, you just see a total shift in how at least the declassified documents we have talk about religion. And I think the big place you see that, or the big evidence for that, is in the much more suspicious stance that the US takes towards liberation theology in Central and South America. That, right, these are Catholic folks doing it, these are priests in many cases, but they're much more dubious about their aims in a way that just would not have been the case decades earlier. And I think that really is because the model, the assumptions about world religions fall apart in Iran for them.
So you mentioned liberation theology there. So Catholicism and the relationship to Catholicism plays a really big part, in this story. As you kind of talk about, it was almost like how the book kind of came to be, was those attitudes. And you kind of talk about one of the reasons it actually fit, at least in some ways, or became this kind of way of shaping things in the beginning, was because of a kind of like the network of Catholicism that already existed. Until just looking at that and being like, oh, that's handy. And then obviously also with particular individuals' personal Catholicism also then opening that up. So, I think, because this is obviously, okay, I'm stepping out into my vague knowledge of US history, but like, before there's even a Catholic president and all this, so like, and there's still a lot more tension, Protestant Catholic tension at this time. So it's, I guess, not self-evident that Catholicism would be this kind of shaping way of thinking about stuff, or viewed as a positive resource in the way of going forward. So yeah, I guess I mentioned a bit about that, how that at the start, in those early days, kind of shapes a bit of how this religious approach gets formed.
Yeah, it's as you note, it is a story about Protestant Catholic tension, at least on the US side of things, which certainly was still very much present during World War II and even after. And so one of the things I note in the book is that the sort of first intelligence agency, the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, is led by this guy, Bill Donovan, who's a prominent Catholic at the time. And it's curious for a number of reasons. One, that a Catholic would be put in charge of this, but also just that the thing that becomes clear quite quickly is that, again, as you mentioned, it's really useful to have Catholic contacts in a global conflict, or on the eve of a global conflict, because, right, the Catholic Church has outposts in so many places and has so many people with so many different skills, language skills, right? I mean, from different cultures and nationalities, and that's not a small thing. And so one of the ironies of this part of the book, when I look at World War II, is that there's a great interest among the Americans to sort of crack the Vatican, to sort of figure out how to access the Vatican as this information node. There was this idea, right, that really, I mean, it's really fueled by quite anti-Catholic ideas, ironically, even by many American Catholics, right? The Vatican is this kind of like octopus with its tentacles all over the world, that, right, information gets funneled back to Rome, and the Pope is just sort of like flipping through reports and whatever. And of course, it's worth pointing out for anyone listening, we now know that was not the case, that the Vatican was largely locked out from the war. They had very limited information, but the assumption on the Americans was that they had tons. And so it was very interesting for the Americans to try to access this. But of course, then the Americans who were trying to access this information then had to sort of turn around and sell it to their higher ups back in the US. And in many cases were met by very dubious assessments that, like, well, this is Catholic stuff, right? Or, well, this is from the Vatican, right? Can we really trust this? These people aren't pro-American, they aren't pro-freedom, whatever. And it becomes clear, I think, to many of the intelligence operatives that I study, that by the end of World War II, if they're going to develop the Vatican, if they're going to develop a study of world religions as a profitable way to challenge communism, they're going to have to change, or attempt to change, how Americans think about Catholics more generally.
I want to come to that point in a second, but I was just also thinking, as a side point, it's kind of, fortunate in a lot of ways that this Catholicism link came in early, because otherwise, how would we had all these spy movies with all these great scenes in Catholic cathedrals, people meeting and sitting in a pew, and the other guy sitting in the pew in front, we're not really talking, or fake confessional booths, like all that kind of, what would have we done without that?
For drama, it really is.
So I think, it is interesting to think about that, as you said there, that wanted to change the attitudes at home, because obviously, like, a lot of this book, a lot of this story is about, because of the nature of the CIA, foreign engagement, right? Engagement outside of the borders of the US. But as you have, there's this distinct, need to shape attitudes and shape the way religion is configured in domestically as well. So was that something that there was like, like, I guess how, right? In some way, the question, like, was it like, more of an explicit campaign, or was it this, trying to just change those attitudes? Because that's an interesting idea, right? That the domestic attitudes of Americans have been shaped, by an intelligence, agency. Because I think there's a bit in the book we kind of talk about, religion was a source for how this world religions idea was a source for how they thought, but was also something they then shaped in the way it was thought about. So it was not just all this, okay, we're just taking something and consuming it over here, but it also then kind of became a back and forth relationship.
Absolutely, yeah. It's that's a good way to put it. I mean, it's a back and forth relationship. As these intelligence officers are doing their work, they're of course shaped by their own education, their own culture, the kinds of religious tropes that were common at that point in American culture. But one of the things I try to show in the book is that really even by the early 50s, but certainly into the 60s and afterwards, there's also just tons of other very important changes happening in American culture. And so the question about how much was this sort of intentional or planned, I don't know that it was. I think it's planned in bits and pieces. I think certain efforts are put into place to sort of shift American perception sometimes, but it's very haphazard. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the challenge of telling the story, is because I think the evidence is pretty clear that it's haphazard, but I also argue that I don't think that makes the consequences of this work any less sort of challenging or profound, because all of this is happening alongside major changes to how Americans are thinking about religious minorities, racial minorities. There's kind of a huge explosion in domestic interest in world religions, right? Like the Life magazine features articles about like, what is a Buddhism and stuff like this, and sort of explaining this to like a rapt audience about what's going on here, because there's a demand for this information. And the intelligence officers themselves are affected by this. And so I think what you end up seeing is that what starts as an interest in Catholicism, especially in World War II, particularly in relation to the Vatican as like this sort of information network, becomes and over time morphs into seeing Catholicism as a model for understanding other world religions. And that, right, if we can do this with Catholicism, we can do this with other traditions, and then think about all the other sources of information we could tap, or contacts we could reach.
So it was interesting, you talked about a little bit, touched on this earlier, like the way this whole thing then crashes into this general idea of American exceptionalism, that as you said before, that naturally religions have to be pro-democracy, anti-communism, pro-free market. And I'm thinking about, so you've obviously taken this kind of essentialized idea of what religion stands for, and then there's this identification of, and that at its essential is also America, and what America stands for, kind of thing. And bringing those together. I'm not sure how much you've got, thinking about how other intelligence agencies in different countries like were thinking about religion or approaching religion. Was there distinct, some crossover, or was this kind of like, was there a very distinct American brand for how they were thinking of going about this, that kind of was birthed of that exceptionalism?
Yes, I have not done that work myself, but I've read it, especially with the example of the British in World War II and afterwards. The British themselves had an office sort of dedicated to this kind of work, which I think, in my understanding anyway, stems out of the much longer sort of colonial project there, right? Religions as a means of control. But I think the US is different for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is just of course, the peculiarly different US history and culture, but the second and probably more important part is just the scale. And so right after World War II, just the scale of the US national security state, the amount of funding, the ability for the US to project power globally, right, and including through its intelligence services, I think just sort of puts this in a different league entirely.
And so And you've got another chapter of the book, you focus on Vietnam, and the conflict there, and US taking the imperial place of France in that way, and that also then feeding into how to think about Catholicism, as there's this desire to say, to show that this group of South Vietnamese Catholics are going to be naturally aligned with who we are, and so that both kind of and the US thinking that, hey, an appeal to Mary will be enough to form an alliance here, to show that we're simpatico and all of that. So again, this kind of idea that, I guess, in this religious approach can trump all other kind of aspects of allegiance and identity and desire kind of thing. And I guess, curious about, because that's obviously also coinciding with this, again, this popular interest in world religions. So and this probably coinciding with, hey, we're now involved out in this region of the world in a bigger way. So we want to know that, but also we think this particular religion can in Catholicism it can come in a strategic way here. So I'm curious a bit about the way the Vietnam conflict and the lead up to kind of shaped this story a bit.
Yeah, there's a really fascinating document that I use in the book, but it's a record of a conversation that President Eisenhower had with his national security team as the sort of very early American involvement in Vietnam was getting underway in the 50s. And someone suggests, well, what about the religious angle? Like, what can we do about religion here? And someone points out that, well, it looks like, most of South Vietnam is Buddhist. And another person sort of at the table, right, says like, oh, that's not going to work because the Buddha was a lover rather than a fighter. And we need someone who's going to fight. And as someone who teaches religious, just makes me pull my hair out, because, right, it's again, this most overly parodied sort of essentialized idea of religion, right? And that's just where the conversation stops. Like, Buddha was a lover, not a fighter. Like, I don't know what that means, right? And I do this for a living. But they say, well, there's a Catholic minority, and someone says like Joan of Arc, like she was a fighter, and they're like, yeah, right. And so they sort of decide to play up the Catholic element in South Vietnam, and that decision-making process, right, leaves a lot to be desired in terms of why you're choosing what you're choosing. But that seems to be what it was, right? It was just like that. And already, right, they're not consulting, world religions textbooks necessarily. I don't know for sure, but I would wager, right, that's informed by pop culture coverage of various world religions, something you can read in the paper one day, whatever. But then we're off to the races. And so there's this appeal to sort of make South Vietnam, at least make it appear as a sort of devoutly Catholic country threatened by godless communism, as a means to both raise, American awareness of Vietnam, to sort of make them think of it as a Christian country that we need to help and everything else. But then also ideally, and it was never clear to me in reading the research here how this was supposed to happen, but also to sort of bind South Vietnam together in a way that would make it more resilient to or against the threat of communism. And so, yeah, you end up seeing, what I think is just sort of absolutely wild stuff, right? That the way to motivate Catholics to tell them to do something is to tell them Mary wants them to do it, right? And you get the sense reading the reports of these guys that they're like, yeah, the North Vietnamese Catholics don't want to move to Saigon. And then you say okay, well, what if we drop flyers that say the Virgin Mary's moving to Saigon, right? And people are like, yeah, and you can hear them high-fiving and stuff in the background, right? That'll do it. And then they're just sort of confused, when this doesn't pan out. Although actually in that specific case, this was another instance where, for a variety of reasons, there's been really good research done that shows for a variety of reasons, there was the sort of demographic shift, this immigration shift south to Saigon, probably had nothing to do with those flyers, right? But nonetheless, this is another instance where the sort of feedback loop is hey, this works, right? The religious approach is paying off. Yeah, and I don't, part of the challenge with this book is not turning it into something where the US government was sort of never successful in using any of this, because not for any kind of moral reasons, but just because, right, there were times where this pans out. There were sort of there's reasons to study religion and to apply it in certain contexts if your goal is to manipulate people or to achieve some sort of desired end. And it does pay off sometimes, right? And we do see that in other places in Vietnam. But yeah, the appeals to Catholicism were pretty, not sure the best word, pretty crude.
Yeah,
for
right.
sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. You kind of talk a bit about the book about, both intelligence histories and histories of religion. Have this tendency to veer toward the exotic, right? Like, there are ample stories of truly wild things that are salacious. And I mean, you open the book with one that
Yeah, yeah,
using telepaths to try to spy on Pope John Paul II from a distance,
yeah,
and like, you could just write a book that's just like, I guess, imagine, peppered with salacious exotic stories. But I think even just from that kind of account then is so important to say, how much of this is mundane, right? How much of this is like people sitting around a table, oh, I've kind of, somewhere from pop culture got this idea of X equals Y.
right.
So let's do it. And catastrophic consequences in some ways, or sometimes dumb
Yes.
luck, or whatever. But like, that's an interesting thing. And as you say, and obviously applies to how we think about religious studies too. And it's so much of this is just ordinary people doing ordinary things, thinking about how they can get through a certain situation in the most advantageous ways.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's yes, working in religious studies and sort of, visiting intelligence studies, intelligence history, which is a fascinating sort of subfield in its own, which I've really enjoyed my time in. But they both very much struggle with, I think, assumptions from people outside those fields, which is right. They expect, just really over the top dramatic stuff. Really, intelligence histories are supposed to be filled with like explosions and car chases, right? And again, I think it's a pop culture feedback loop about James Bond or whatever. And I run into the same thing in religious studies when I'm in my, introductory courses, when I teach about world religions or something like this. Anytime I use the word sacrifice, I'll always have some students who are like, oh, human sacrifice. And it's like, no, we're not, like, no, that's not, this is not that class, right? Like, but it's again, this idea that this must be what we're talking about. And yeah, the reality in both religious studies and in intelligence studies, I think, is that the most interesting stuff is happening in places that just seem really absolutely boring, just dreadfully mundane, completely unsexy. But that's where a lot of this real work is happening. And I think paying attention to it can be boring, but I think, right, the consequences of that can be quite serious and pays to pay attention to it. I mean, just, for people who've seen James Bond movies, I don't even actually know how to sum up a James Bond movie, right? I mean, it's just nonstop action, but like, in a James Bond movie, he never convenes like 4 people from the University of Chicago to advise him on like a proper like tea ceremony in Japan, and then 3 of them, right, disagree with the 4th because of like some long-held departmental grudge from 15 years ago. And it's just like the kind of ridiculous stuff about being human that shows up again and again in these stories, is, that plays a role in the outcomes we get. And I think it's important to pay attention to that.
I have heard that the latest, the soon to be released last Daniel Craig Bond film is almost 3 hours. So maybe that's why. Maybe they've, really filled it out with some scenes like that. Yeah.
Yeah. They haven't reached out to me to consult, sadly, but I mean, if they do, I'm definitely open to it if anyone's listening. But yeah, I'm sure we could work in that scene somehow. Yeah.
I'll tag Miramax when we post this episode. Good. Just to try to like get some juice. So I'm interested to think, we started right at the beginning talking a bit about how, religious studies of the time and this developing world religions paradigm shaped a lot of what happened next. And now, as someone, writing this book, as a professor of religion, and, I guess if you think like, is there some sort of lesson for religious studies and how we think about both in the academic and the popular realm, the way we, talk about religion, and particularly, religions beyond, religions out there kind of thing that maybe is heeded from this book in some ways. I mean, like, the way that it's, so quickly utilized and to be a manipulative tool in order to secure power and goodwill.
Yeah. I think there's a couple things that jump out to me. I mean, I think, one way to read the book and one way I wrote it was really with an eye toward the consequences of these kinds of ideas, which were usually paid for by people who weren't American. and in various places around the world, right? And many of those stories have been sort of overlooked or brushed aside, in part because they are so mundane, right? These really sort of small acts that, time and time again, add up to something that, again, I think we should pay attention to. But I guess another thing, or another kind of related part of that, is that, academic theories, ideas we talk about in the ivory tower do have real consequences. Similarly, I think pop culture matters. I think paying attention to pop culture is actually important, right? I mean, it's usually sort of dismissed as, or it's easily dismissed as frivolous or silly, right? But the kinds of things that interest people, why they interest people, what sells, this is important stuff. And the story I tell in this book is really only a story that I was able to put together because I tried to pay attention to those things. And I guess the only other thing that comes to mind right now that I threw out there is also just, again, the sheer scale of the US government and its spending and its reach around the world, I think is something that a lot of folks, American and not, sort of take for granted, even if, they're not wild about it. But it has enabled and does enable the US government to do some remarkable things. And I mean that in a sort of literal sense of the word, right? Not necessarily like a good thing, just remarkable. And that's a story that I think is sometimes uncomfortable, particularly for Americans, to pay attention to, but I think is also just really, really important.
So maybe as we kind of start to land the plane, thinking about, kind of, you say the climax of the book in some ways is the 79, the Iranian Revolution, and how that, creates this real shift in, okay, how is religion going to be utilized, thought about, changed? And then we know, obviously, post September 11 and the change in terms of this. I guess I'm thinking about, how do you feel like, even though there's been that shift, as you say, there's that dramatic change in that, how does this history from, from the early days of the OSS to kind of that time help, I guess, create that foundation for thinking about the last 20 years? Whether some of those changes, even though there's been a change and a distinction, like there's still a sense of, like, this legacy of this influence of the time before, or even just thinking about, this is what they're trying to get away from. Sometimes, if you know what the people are trying to avoid, you kind of could sometimes understand a bit of what they're trying to do now.
Yeah. I think one thing that really lingers with me is, I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but it's much easier to find something if you're looking for it. And by that, I mean, even though the context has changed, I don't really go much past the early 80s in my book. I don't touch on post 9/11 stuff. I think the idea still, though, that many Americans in positions of power have had, right, that religion is just sort of an incredibly important category for everyone around the world, right? That you can understand so much through it. It isn't to say that that's necessarily wrong in all cases or something like that, but this insistence, right, that religion is a central category through which we understand people or make policy or determine foreign policy or whatever, I think does repeat some of the challenges that I chronicle in my book. And I mean, there's been, of course, just a dramatic 180-degree turn in understanding of Islam. I mean, in my book, in the early Cold War, I just talk about how much Islam was held up as like the, this great anti-communist ally, in part because it was seen as, old-fashioned, but kind of charmingly so, right? And like, they were really quaint, but like they offered you a lot of tea, and like, it was just that kind of thing, which of course, right, was fueled by all sorts of, racist and sort of anti-Muslim assumptions anyway, right? Even as it had this kind of nice, veneer of shiny paint on it. But of course, that's changed, right? And now we see the consequences of that. So yeah, I guess I would say that, again, the fixation on religion as a sort of meaningful category for national security is something that we absolutely still see in the headlines.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. Folks, the book is Errand into the Wilderness of Mirrors, Religion and the History of the CIA, as I said, out with University of Chicago Press. Please check it out. We've barely scratched the surface of the book in our conversation today. There's so much to be gained and to be enjoyed in its pages. Other than the book, Michael, is there anything else you want to promote or draw people's attention to at this time?
No, no. I have a new book out and an 18-month-old at home. So those are like my RAM is already sort of spinning. Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, thanks for joining us. And folks, we'll see you all next week. Bye.